It was a tragedy that no one who was alive at the time will ever forget, and yet we've uncovered some serious problems with the way the media have told this story again and again. Here is my report from New York. It was here at Manhattan's Roosevelt Hospital 35 years ago that a police car brought John Lennon after he had been shot by a crazed fan. Initially identified just as John Doe, not as a world-famous musician who changed the culture, but after years of inaccurate reporting, the full story of what happened that night has never fully been told. Dr. David Halloran, a 29-year-old third-year resident at Roosevelt back in 1980, is telling his story to a national audience for the first time.
He had 4 shots over the front of the chest, 3 exit wounds out the back, not responsive, no pulse, and we immediately just opened up his chest. I opened up his chest, his heart's intact. A lot of blood.
What makes Halloran's story remarkable is that over the years, 2 other doctors have taken credit for the emergency surgery performed on John Lennon, and each drew major media attention. Halloran, now a surgeon in Syracuse, New York, was first interviewed by the producers of a new film, The Lennon Report, that is being unveiled next week. Why is he speaking out now?
It's just unseemly for a professional going around saying, hi, I'm Dave Halloran, I took care of John Lennon. I've never done that.
Had you done that over your career, you would have gotten a lot more media attention.
Yeah, but I think I would have come across as a butthead.
Barbara Kammerer was one of the nurses in that trauma room.
David was on the opposite side of the stretcher than I was. He had his chest open, and he had his hands in his chest, trying to find where the bleeders were.
Alicia Egan was also in room 115 as a nurse anesthetist.
David was taking care of his end, which was cardiac massage. Dr. Halloran did a wonderful job that night, and he deserves credit.
After Lennon was pronounced dead, Halloran wrote up the medical report, which Roosevelt Hospital has never released. Dr. Stephen Lynn, who ran Roosevelt's emergency department, asked Halloran if he wanted to help brief the media mob outside.
I basically didn't. I wanted to crawl under a rock. I just wanted to go home. I think I was just a little bit distraught. I was upset. You feel somewhat responsible. You always wonder what it could have you done different.
So Dr. Lynn addressed the waiting reporters.
John Lennon was brought to the emergency room at the Roosevelt site, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, this evening, shortly before 11 p.m.
Stephen Lynn, speaking on behalf of the hospital, said nothing about performing the surgery himself. Halloran says another physician, Richard Marks, had come into the trauma room about halfway through the operation, but played only an advisory role. On the 10th anniversary of Lennon's murder, People magazine ran a major story titled The Day the Music Died, the magazine describing Dr. Marks as the man who operated on Lennon. Marks, who's now deceased, is quoted as saying, "When I realized he wasn't going to make it, I just sewed him back up. I felt helpless."
Dr. Halloran was doing open cardiac massage, and Dr. Marks did not have to do anything at that time that I know of.
So Richard Marks did not touch John Lennon's body?
No.
Halloran later ran into Dr. Marks in a hospital lounge.
I go up to him and just bust his chops, and I said, "Let me shake the hand of the man and try to save John Lennon." And he goes, sort of sheepishly goes, "Well, Dave, you know how it is, you know how the media is, you know how the papers are, and ha-ha."
In the wave of media coverage on the 25th anniversary of Lennon's death, there was a new medical story. The New York Times said that Stephen Lynn, the former administrator, was the one who massaged Lennon's heart. Did you personally open John Lennon's chest?
I personally opened his chest, scalpel in hand, right below his rib, across his chest, yes. And I held his heart in my hand, attempting to massage his heart, trying to get what little blood was left in his body to circulate as best as it could.
But those who were there tell a different story.
Stephen Lynn arrived in room 115 at the point where John Lennon was about to be pronounced dead or already was pronounced dead.
Another nurse, Dee Sato, told me, and here told the filmmakers, that things were wrapping up when Dr. Lynn arrived.
When he got there, it was pretty much almost finished because they had done everything they could possibly do.
Dr. Lynn came in towards the end of the resuscitation, or at the end of it.
Did Stephen Lynn touch the body?
He did not, no.
As I put these questions to Dr. Lynn, he began to backtrack. 4 people who were there, David Halloran, Barbara Kammerer, Aisha Egan, Dee Soda, have told us that it was Dr. Halloran who performed this emergency resuscitation and that you arrived toward the end.
I was there at the very beginning. It may have been Dr. Halloran that held the knife. I can't remember exactly who held the knife. I was there before any of the other doctors were there. I was the director of the emergency department.
Why do you think that 4 people would have a different recollection of that emotional night than you do?
Because it's been 35 years since then. I don't remember exactly who held the knife. I certainly thought that it was my hand on the knife. It may very well have been Dr. Halloran's, and perhaps it was David that opened the chest, but I'm not certain.
Could it also have been Dr. David Halloran that massaged John Lennon's heart and not you?
No.
How do you know?
That I know I did.
How do you know? How are you so
Because
sure?
I remember it.
Is it possible in the passage of time that you have conflated the memories of what you did and what your colleagues did?
Not on this issue and not on most of the other issues.
Is there any doubt in your mind that Stephen Lynn did not touch John Lennon's body that night?
No, there's no doubt.
There are other discrepancies. Dr. Lynn says he was called back to the hospital after a long shift. He told me he didn't know the patient was the former Beatle.
Had no idea who the patient was. We didn't have any idea who the patient was until after he actually arrived in the trauma room.
But Dee Soda told me she contacted Lynn when she learned the patient was Lennon and would not have called him for a regular gunshot victim.
Dee called Steve Lynn, who was the administrator of the emergency room, because we had a famous person present.
Unless you're John Kenny or John Lennon, you're not going to call it. If you're John Doe, no one's going to be woken up.
In the New York Times story a decade ago, Dr. Lynn added a chilling detail about giving Yoko Ono the sad news, which he repeated to me.
She was on the floor, pounding her head against a concrete floor at that moment. I put my hands behind her head, didn't want her to harm herself.
Barbara Kammerer was in the room with Dr. Lynn and Yoko Ono.
Steve Lynn was not in the room long enough to even observe if she banged her head on the floor or not. And Yoko Ono did absolutely not bang her head on the floor. She did not wail. She acted completely appropriate to the situation. She had just seen her husband shot, and now Yoko was told John Lennon was dead. I was very angry when I heard Steve say that. Every time I had heard Steve interviewed, it was more and more and more embellished.
Do you think Yoko Ono was smeared in these interviews?
I do, yes, honestly. I think that she was smeared.
Dr. Lynn has also said in interviews that he gave the nurses this warning about potentially lucrative souvenirs.
That none of you runs out of the room with the sheets that have John Lennon's blood on them or dirty parts of your clothing or your tie that has a spot of John Lennon's blood. We have to protect that.
He was just being a pompous ass, and there was no need to even say anything like that because none of our staff would have done it. It was very, very insulting and demeaning to the nursing staff.
And it didn't happen?
No, absolutely not.
David Halloran was unaware of the publicity swirling around Lynn, who talked to outlets ranging from New York's Daily News to the AP. But in 2010, on the 30th anniversary of Lennon's death, Stephen Lynn showed up on ESPN, on Fox News, and on a CNN special that Halloran happened to see. And the story that Dr. Lynn told made headlines around the world. What did you see and how did you react?
What I saw was Dr. Lynn being interviewed. He had his hands out in front of him, making a pumping motion, like as if he were pumping a heart, basically saying that he took care of John Lennon and had massaged his heart. And that just, it was a tipping point for me. This just seemed very disingenuous, and I just, it may be somewhat insulting to me.
Other than a couple of local interviews he gave in Syracuse that made no mention of the conflicting accounts, Halloran has stayed out of the national spotlight. Decades after leaving Roosevelt Hospital, where his father was also a doctor, David Halloran says he's now speaking out for the sake of historical accuracy. Has this changed your view of the American media?
Yeah, I'm a lot more skeptical now than I was 35 years ago. I think it. I don't know who watches the watchers. I mean, I don't know who fact checks the fact checkers.
John Lennon's legend will live forever, and Beatles music seems as popular as ever. But we now have the last piece of the puzzle of what happened at this hospital, and the surgeon who avoided the limelight all these years finally getting his due. Roosevelt Hospital didn't answer my questions, but Yoko Ono gave me this statement on Friday, quote, "I did not bang my head on anything, let alone a concrete floor. This is the first time I hear this story. All the time I had in mind that I had to stay calm and well for Sean's sake. If I had banged my head on anything, I might have gotten a head injury. That would have been very bad for me and my son. I thought I had to stay as strong as I could for him."